The woman standing in the rain looked like someone the world had forgotten. Her nurse's uniform was faded. Her shoes were worn. In her hands, she carried an old envelope that looked completely unimportant. A young nurse glanced at her and laughed. Another whispered something to a doctor, and he rolled his eyes before walking inside. It lasted only a few seconds. The kind of humiliation people forget almost immediately. But before the day ended, everyone who laughed at that woman would be standing in stunned silence. One man would lose everything. Others would beg for forgiveness. And the nurse they had ignored for 15 years would reveal a secret powerful enough to change the future of an entire hospital. Her name was Evelyn Carter. For 15 years, she worked at St. Matthew's Medical Center. She cleaned wounds, comforted dying patients, and sat beside frightened families in the darkest moments of their lives. Patients loved her. Families trusted her. But many of her coworkers barely noticed her. To them, she was simply the older nurse with the old handbag. Nobody knew anything about her private life. Nobody wondered why she never complained. And nobody imagined that hidden inside the envelope she carried that morning was a document that would turn the hospital upside down. But to understand why that envelope mattered so much, you have to go back a few years. Every Christmas, while most of the staff went home to celebrate, Evelyn volunteered for the night shift. When a little boy named Tyler spent his final days battling cancer, it was Evelyn who stayed beside him when everyone else had gone home. When an elderly man had no family to visit him, she brought him dinner and sat with him for hours. When a single mother couldn't afford medication, Evelyn quietly paid for it herself. Nobody knew where she found the money. Nobody asked. They simply assumed she was an unusually kind nurse. The truth was, every act of kindness was part of a promise she had made to her father. A promise that no matter how much power she someday inherited, she would never forget what it felt like to stand beside ordinary people. And now that promise was about to be tested. Recently, the atmosphere inside St. Matthew's had changed. Rumors of financial problems had spread through every department. There was talk of layoffs, department closures, even whispers that the hospital itself might be sold. Staff members worried constantly. Some feared losing their jobs. Others worried about the patients who depended on them. Nurses spoke in hushed voices during breaks. Doctors checked job listings in secret. Even the janitors wondered if they would still have work next month. At the center of it all stood the hospital administrator, Richard Bennett. He was confident, respected, and always seemed to have an answer. But many employees believed he cared more about numbers than people. To Richard, the hospital was a business. To Evelyn, it was a place where lives were entrusted to them. Over the previous year, she had watched things change. A children's therapy program had been quietly shut down. A community outreach clinic had lost funding. Staffing levels had been reduced, forcing nurses to work double shifts. Each time she asked questions, she received the same answer: budget cuts. But Evelyn had begun to suspect there was something else going on. Something nobody else could see. The night before everything changed, she stayed late to finish paperwork. As she walked past an office, she heard voices. The door wasn't fully closed. Inside, Richard Bennett was speaking to someone on the phone. Once the departments are shut down, the value of the property increases, he said. Evelyn froze. She couldn't hear everything, but she heard enough. Then he said something that sent a chill through her. By tomorrow, it'll all be finalized. She quietly walked away. Her hands trembled, because tomorrow was the final day of her 15-year condition. Tomorrow she would become the owner of St. Matthew's. And if Richard was planning something terrible, she had very little time left. That rainy morning, an emergency meeting was announced. Attendance was mandatory. The conference room filled quickly. The air felt heavy. Richard stood at the front and cleared his throat. "I know many of you have heard the rumors," he said. "St. Matthew's is facing serious financial challenges. Major changes may be necessary." Whispers spread through the room. Some nurses looked frightened. One doctor lowered his head. Then from the back, a hand slowly rose. It was Evelyn. Richard looked surprised. "Yes." She stood. Her voice was calm. "Will patient care still come first?" The room became completely silent. Richard smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I think decisions like these are a little above your pay grade." A few people laughed. Someone whispered loudly, "She's just a nurse." More laughter followed. Evelyn didn't argue. She simply sat down. But as she lowered her eyes, she touched the envelope inside her handbag. Then she looked at the clock. In less than 3 hours, everything would change. As she returned to her department, she passed a young nurse named Melissa. "Why do you always ask questions?" Melissa said with a laugh. "It's not like management listens to people like us." Evelyn smiled gently. "Sometimes asking the right question changes everything." Melissa shook her head and walked away. She had no idea how true those words were. A few minutes later, Evelyn entered room 204. Inside lay Mr. Harrison, an elderly patient she had cared for months. "You look worried today," he said. She smiled. "Do I? You've always carried the world's problems on your shoulders." She laughed softly. "I suppose I do." The old man reached for her hand. "Whatever happens today, remember something." "What?" "You've spent years helping people. Good things eventually happen to people like you." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. She squeezed his hand and left the room. Moments later, her phone rang. She answered. A voice said only 4 words. "We've arrived." Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. "Thank you," she replied softly. Then she ended the call. Minutes later, several black luxury cars entered the hospital parking lot. Employees stopped and stared. Men and women in expensive business suits stepped out and walked directly into the lobby. The receptionist looked confused. One of the executives approached her. "We are looking for Ms. Evelyn Carter." "The nurse?" she asked. "Yes, Ms. Evelyn Carter." Within minutes, the entire hospital was buzzing. Doctors stepped out of offices. Nurses gathered in hallways. People whispered the same question. Why were executives looking for an ordinary nurse? Then Richard Bennett appeared. The moment he heard Evelyn's name, his expression changed. The color drained from his face. One executive turned to him. "We need an immediate meeting with the board. And Ms. Evelyn Carter must be present." Richard swallowed hard. For the first time anyone could remember, he looked afraid. A few minutes later, the emergency board meeting began. The hospital directors sat around the large table, confused and anxious. Then the doors opened. Evelyn Carter walked inside wearing the same faded nurse's uniform. Several people nearly stood from their chairs. Richard stared at her in disbelief. One executive rose to speak. "My name is Jonathan Reed. I represent the Carter Family Trust." The room became silent. He continued. "Many years ago, the founder of St. Matthew's Medical Center established a trust to protect this hospital and ensure it would always place patients before profits. He turned toward Evelyn. That founder was Ms. Evelyn Carter's father. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Richard looked like he had forgotten how to speak. Jonathan continued. Before his death, he left majority ownership of this hospital to his daughter. However, there was one condition. He paused. She would not inherit control until she spent 15 years working here as an ordinary employee without revealing her identity. Gasps filled the room. Several board members looked at Evelyn in complete shock. 15 years. The quiet nurse had spent 15 years walking these halls while secretly being the future owner of the hospital. Jonathan smiled. Those 15 years ended today. He held up several documents. As of this moment, Evelyn Carter is the majority owner of St. Matthew's Medical Center. Silence. Then every eye in the room turned toward her. The woman they had ignored. The woman they had laughed at. The woman they believed was insignificant. She now owned the hospital. But Jonathan wasn't finished. There is one more matter. He opened another folder. Over the last year, Mr. Bennett has been negotiating a private deal to sell St. Matthew's Medical Center to an investment group. Several board members looked stunned. He planned to close departments, reduce patient programs, and eliminate staff positions to increase profits before the sale. One director stood up. Is that true? Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. Jonathan placed several documents on the table. These are signed agreements, emails, and financial records. The room erupted. Board members argued. Some looked furious. Others looked completely betrayed. Richard finally spoke. You don't understand. The hospital needed money. Evelyn looked at him calmly. So your solution was to sell the people who trusted us. You don't know how hard this job is. For the first time, Evelyn's voice became firm. I know exactly how hard it is. I've spent 15 years watching nurses skip meals because they were too busy caring for patients. I've watched doctors cry after losing children. I've watched families sleep in waiting rooms praying for miracles. She stepped forward. This hospital is not a building, it is people. The room became silent. Then she said the words nobody expected. There will be no sale. Several people gasped. There will be no layoffs. Tears filled one board member's eyes. And every patient program that was scheduled to be cut will remain open. A nurse outside the room began crying. Then she turned toward Richard. As for Mr. Bennett, she paused. You no longer work here. The words hit him like a hammer. You can't do this, he said weakly. Evelyn looked directly into his eyes. I already have. Security was called. And for the first time in years, Richard Bennett walked through the halls of St. Matthew's with his head lowered. The same employees who once admired him now stared in silence. News spread through the hospital in minutes. The owner was nurse Evelyn Carter. Layoffs were cancelled. The hospital had been saved. Nurses gathered outside the boardroom. Many couldn't believe it. When Evelyn finally stepped into the hallway, nobody knew what to say. Then the young nurse who had laughed at her that morning stepped forward. Tears filled her eyes. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Another nurse lowered her head. We never should have treated you that way. Others began apologizing too. Evelyn listened quietly. Then she smiled. I didn't stay here for 15 years to hear apologies. They looked at her. I stayed because I love this hospital. She glanced around the hallway. And because every person here deserves the chance to become better. Nobody spoke. Many were crying. The woman they had underestimated had just shown them more grace than they deserved. 3 days later, employees gathered for another meeting. This time, Evelyn stood at the front. Not as a nurse, not as a mystery, but as the owner of St. Matthew's Medical Center. She looked at the faces in front of her. Then she said something nobody would ever forget. Titles can be misleading, expensive suits can be misleading, old uniforms can be misleading. She smiled gently, but character always reveals the truth. The room remained silent. Never decide someone's worth by their appearance. You may be looking at someone whose story you know nothing about. Then she made another announcement. Every laid-off employee would be rehired. The children's therapy program would reopen. Additional support would be provided to low-income patients. The entire room erupted into applause. Some people were crying openly. Others stood to their feet. Even Melissa, the young nurse who had laughed at her, wiped tears from her eyes. As everyone applauded, Evelyn looked toward the window. Rain was falling again. The same rain that had greeted her that morning. Only now, everything had changed. For 15 years, Evelyn Carter had walked those halls unnoticed. And in a single day, she reminded everyone of a lesson far more valuable than money or power. The people we overlook are sometimes the very people holding our future in their hands. But there's one question that still remains. If Evelyn had revealed her identity years earlier, would the hospital have become a better place sooner? Or did those 15 hidden years teach her exactly what she needed to know? What do you think happened that night when Richard Bennett made that phone call? Was he desperate to save the hospital, or was greed his true motive? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched you, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who believes kindness still matters. And if you thought this was shocking, wait until you hear what happened in our next case. Subscribe for more real-life crime twists, unbelievable secrets, and stories that prove you should never underestimate anyone.